Before we begin this story of redemption and recognition, if you love tales where the rejected become sacred and the forgotten become legendary, hit that like button, subscribe to Alpha Reversed, and drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest, because tonight's journey will shatter you before it rebuilds you into something unbreakable. The alley behind the abandoned factory had become her sanctuary in a world that had no place for her, a narrow stretch of cracked concrete where the moonlight barely reached and the city's judgment couldn't quite penetrate the shadows that had learned to embrace her when no one else would. She had fashioned a shelter from discarded cardboard boxes and a tattered tarp she'd found in a dumpster 3 weeks ago, creating a fragile cocoon that kept out the worst of the winter wind, but did nothing to shield her from the cold that lived deeper than her bones. The kind of cold that came from being cast out by her own pack, from being told she was too weak to matter, too broken to deserve the bond that every Omega dreamed of from the moment they first understood what it meant to be incomplete. Her name was Lyra, though she'd almost forgotten the sound of it spoken with anything other than contempt. And she had been surviving in these streets for 8 months now, ever since her former Pax Alpha had looked at her with those dismissive eyes and declared her unworthy of their protection, a defective Omega whose scent was too faint, whose presence was too forgettable, whose very existence was an embarrassment to a pack that prided itself on strength and perfection. She had learned to move through the world like a ghost, taking odd jobs that paid under the table, accepting food from the backs of restaurants that would never let her through the front door, and sleeping in places where most people were too afraid to walk during daylight because when you had nothing left to lose, fear became just another luxury you couldn't afford. The rain had started an hour before midnight, a cold November downpour that turned the alley into a river of filth and made her cardboard walls sag with the weight of water they were never meant to hold. And she was trying to reinforce the corners with plastic bags when she heard the sound that didn't belong in her world of desperate silence and careful invisibility. It was the scrape of boots on wet concrete, heavy and uneven, followed by a grunt of pain that carried the kind of depth that spoke of serious injury and serious power being brought low by whatever force had managed to wound something that was clearly not meant to be wounded. She froze, her Omega instincts screaming at her to hide, to make herself smaller, to disappear into the shadows the way she'd learned to disappear from every space that didn't want her. But then she caught the scent on the rain-soaked air and her entire world tilted on an axis she didn't know existed. It was alpha pheromones, but not like any she'd encountered in the sanitized, civilized world of pack hierarchies and social structures. This was something primal and ancient, carrying notes of pine forest and winter storms, and blood that had been spilled in battles that predated the concrete jungle around them. And underneath it all was a thread of pain so profound that her Omega nature responded before her rational mind could override the instinct to help, to heal, to comfort the wounded. Even when every lesson she'd learned on these streets told her that powerful alphas were the most dangerous creatures in the world, especially to rejected Omegas who had no pack to avenge them if they disappeared into the kind of darkness that swallowed the forgotten. He collapsed at the mouth of her alley, a massive figure in torn tactical gear that was soaked through with rain and darker substances that could only be blood, and when lightning flashed, she saw his face for the first time and felt something crack open in her chest that she'd thought had been sealed shut forever by rejection and abandonment, and 8 months of learning that hope was the cruelest lie of all. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. All sharp angles and brutal strength even brought low by injury, with dark hair plastered to his skull and eyes that burned like molten gold even as they struggled to focus through what was clearly significant blood loss and possible head trauma. His right side was torn open, claw marks that could only have come from another alpha of significant power, and his breathing was labored in a way that suggested broken ribs and possibly punctured lung. And every instinct Lyra possessed was screaming contradictory commands. Run away before he notices you. Help him before he dies. Hide before whatever did this to him comes looking for the kill. She stood there paralyzed by indecision for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds before his eyes found hers through the rain and the darkness, and she watched something like surprise flicker across his face, followed by an emotion she couldn't quite name, but that looked disturbingly like recognition, as though he'd been searching for something and had just found it in the last place anyone would think to look, in a homeless Omega, huddled in an alley with nothing to her name but cardboard walls and the kind of invisible courage it took to survive when the world had made it clear your survival didn't matter. His voice when he spoke was rough as gravel and twice as sharp, carrying an authority that even massive injury couldn't diminish completely, and he said words that would change everything, though neither of them understood it yet, in that moment of rain and blood and impossible chance. "Please," he managed, and that single word from an alpha who looked like he'd never had to beg for anything in his life was enough to break through her paralysis and send her stumbling forward, her small hands reaching for him before her brain caught up with her body's betrayal of every survival instinct she'd developed. "I need shelter, just for tonight. They're hunting me, and I can't lead them to my pack. I just need somewhere to hide until dawn, somewhere no one would think to look." She should have said no, should have protected herself, should have remembered that powerful alphas only acknowledged omegas like her when they wanted something and discarded them the moment that usefulness expired. But there was something in his eyes that looked like the same desperation she saw in her own reflection every time she caught sight of herself in a store window. The look of something precious that the world had decided was worthless, and against all logic and self-preservation. She found herself nodding and helping him to his feet, taking as much of his considerable weight as her small frame could manage, guiding him deeper into the alley toward her pitiful shelter that suddenly seemed even more inadequate when measured against the magnitude of what she was trying to hide. Getting him into her cardboard sanctuary was like trying to fit a wolf into a rabbit's burrow, requiring contortions and careful navigation of his injuries. But somehow they managed it, and once they were inside the cramped space with the tarp pulled closed against the rain, Lyra found herself in closer proximity to an alpha than she'd been since her rejection, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body despite the cold rain, close enough to smell the complexity of his scent, even through the copper tang of blood, close enough to see the exact moment when his eyes focused on her fully, and something like wonder crossed his face, followed immediately by a grief so profound it made her chest ache in sympathy. "You're Omega," he said, and it wasn't a question, but the way he said it carried no contempt, no dismissal. Instead, it sounded like a prayer or possibly an apology, and Lyra felt her carefully constructed walls crack a little more. "I rejected Omega," she corrected him, keeping her voice flat because showing emotion to alphas had never ended well for her. "Cast out by my pack 8 months ago for being defective, too weak to bond, too forgettable to matter. So if you're looking for someone useful, you've stumbled into the wrong alley." She pulled out the first aid kit she'd stolen from a pharmacy 3 months ago, the one she'd been carefully rationing for her own minor injuries, and began assessing his wounds with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, cleaning the claw marks that were already showing signs of infection, wrapping his ribs with strips torn from her only spare shirt, doing everything she'd learned from necessity and desperation while he watched her with those burning gold eyes that seemed to see through all her carefully constructed defenses to the raw, aching need beneath. He caught her wrist as she was reaching for more bandages, his grip gentle despite the strength she could feel coiled in his fingers. And when she looked up at him, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat like a trapped bird. "There's nothing defective about you," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, the kind of certainty that alphas used when declaring pack law or passing judgment, except this judgment was the opposite of everyone she'd received before. "Your scent, it's not weak, it's pure, uncorrupted by pack politics and artificial bonds. You smell like wild lavender and summer rain and something else, something I've only read about in the old texts, in the stories about the first Omegas who walked with the moon herself." Lyra jerked her hand back, her heart pounding because this felt like cruelty disguised as kindness, felt like the setup for a joke she'd be the punchline of, felt like everything her rejection had taught her to fear about letting hope touch her heart again. "Don't," she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended, sharp with the kind of pain that had calcified into armor. "Don't do that. Don't make me believe in pretty words that will evaporate with the morning light. I've survived this long by accepting what I am, a rejected Omega with no pack and no future beyond the next meal and the next safe place to sleep." But he wouldn't look away, wouldn't release her from the intensity of his gaze, and she watched as he struggled to sit up despite his injuries, watched as he reached into a pocket of his tactical gear and pulled out something that gleamed even in the dim light filtering through her tarp. A medallion on a heavy chain that bore markings she'd only seen in history books about the old ways. The ancient packs that ruled before cities and civilization had tried to tame the wild nature of their kind. The medallion bore the symbol of the Blood Moon Pack, the legendary warriors who'd vanished from the civilized world 3 generations ago, retreating into the mountain territories where modern pack law didn't reach and old magic still ran thick in the soil and the water. "My name is Kieran," he said, and the name hit her like a physical blow because even a rejected Omega living on the streets had heard the stories, the whispers of the Blood Moon Alpha who'd refused to take a mate from any of the carefully bred Omega lines the pack councils had presented, who'd walked away from alliances and political marriages to search for something the modern world said didn't exist anymore. A true mate bond uncorrupted by social engineering and careful genetic matching. "Kieran Nightstalker, current alpha of the Blood Moon Pack, and I've been searching for you for 7 years, ever since the night I had a vision of an Omega with lavender eyes sheltering under a broken moon. An Omega the world had cast aside because they couldn't see what she actually was, couldn't recognize a Luna Prime when she was standing right in front of them, begging for acceptance they had no right to withhold." The words should have sounded like madness, like the fever dreams of a dying alpha hallucinating in his final hours. But there was too much certainty in his voice, too much recognition in his eyes, and Lyra felt something inside her responding to the impossible truth he was speaking, felt the part of her she'd tried to bury stirring, like something waking from a long and brutal sleep. She shook her head, backing away as much as the cramped shelter would allow, her voice cracking as she tried to hold on to the reality she'd built from rejection and survival, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. "You're injured and confused. You don't know what you're saying. There hasn't been a Luna Prime born in over 200 years. The bloodline went extinct when the last of the ancient packs fell to the Council's consolidation. I'm just a failed Omega who couldn't even maintain a basic pack bond. I can't be what you think I am." But even as she said the words, pieces were falling into place, memories she'd tried to forget surfacing with cruel clarity. The way her former alpha had looked at her with fear before the contempt settled in. The way the pack's elder had whispered with the other council members before declaring her defective. The recurring dreams she'd had since childhood of running with wolves under a moon that sang with her voice. Visions she'd dismissed as fantasy because accepting them as anything else would have meant accepting that her rejection wasn't about her weakness, but about someone else's fear of her strength. Kieran moved toward her, ignoring the pain the movement clearly caused him, close enough now that she could feel his breath on her face, close enough that his scent was overwhelming her carefully maintained emotional distance. "The reason your pack rejected you wasn't because you were too weak to bond," he said, and each word landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew about herself. "It was because you were too powerful to control. Your Omega nature wasn't responding to artificial pack structures because you were never meant to be subordinate to some territory alpha playing at power. You were meant to stand beside a true alpha as an equal, to channel the moon's own power, to birth the next generation of wolves who would remember what we were before civilization tried to domesticate us into something manageable and safe." The shelter suddenly felt too small to contain what was happening between them. The air crackling with pheromones and possibility, and a destiny Lyra had never allowed herself to imagine, because dreaming of more than survival felt like a betrayal of the hard-won lessons her rejection had taught her. "If what you're saying is true," she whispered, and her voice was barely audible over the sound of rain hammering the tarp above them. "If I really am what you think I am, why did you come here alone, injured and hunted? Why didn't you bring your pack to protect you, to help you find this supposed Luna Prime you've been searching for?" The look that crossed Kieran's face then was pure anguish, a grief so deep it made him look older than his years, made the warrior in him seem suddenly, devastatingly human. "Because I was betrayed," he said, and the word came out like broken glass, sharp enough to cut. "My beta, the wolf I trusted most in this world, made a deal with the pack councils, told them about my vision and my search, and they sent hunters to kill me before I could find you, before I could prove that Luna Primes still exist, and that their carefully controlled breeding programs and political alliance structures are meaningless in the face of true mate bonds and ancient power." He reached up to touch her face, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the line of her jaw, and Lyra found herself leaning into the touch before she could stop herself. 8 months of touch starvation, making her desperate for connection, even as her rational mind screamed warnings about trust and vulnerability and all the ways this could end in more pain. "They're coming for both of us now," he continued. "The hunters who wounded me, the pack councils who want to maintain their power structures, my own beta who chose politics over loyalty. They'll all be searching, and when they find us, they'll kill me and drag you back to be studied and dissected and destroyed because you represent everything they fear. The proof that their modern way of doing things is built on lies and the suppression of what we really are." The night deepened around them, the rain eventually slowing to a drizzle that pattered against the tarp with a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat, and Lyra found herself pressed against Kieran's uninjured side, her small body fitting against his larger frame with a rightness that terrified her because accepting it meant accepting everything else, meant believing that she wasn't broken or defective, meant trusting in a bond she could feel forming between them like spider silk being. Spun from moonlight and old magic, and the kind of recognition that transcended logic or reason. She could feel his heart beating under her palm, strong despite his injuries, steady despite the danger surrounding them, and she realized with a clarity that cut through all her carefully constructed defenses that she'd made a choice the moment she'd helped him into her shelter, had chosen to believe in possibility over safety, in connection over isolation, in a destiny she couldn't yet fully comprehend, but that was calling to her with the moon's own voice. "Tell me about the Blood Moon Pack," she said finally, her voice soft but steady, a bridge being built between her rejected past and the impossible future spreading out before her like uncharted territory. "Tell me what it means to be a Luna Prime, what I would have to become, what we would have to face together if I chose to believe that this isn't just fever dreams and desperate hope." And Kieran began to speak, his voice weaving stories of the old ways, of packs that ran wild under ancient moons, of Omegas who commanded the same respect as Alphas because their power came from different sources but was no less essential, of bonds that were forged in choice and recognition rather than assigned by councils and breeding charts. And as he spoke, Lyra felt something inside her unfurling like a flower that had been crushed beneath boot heels, finally finding the strength to bloom again, felt power she'd never known she possessed stirring in her blood like a song she was just learning to hear. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky beyond her alley in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost mocking in their beauty given the darkness of what they were facing. And Lyra was checking Kieran's wounds again when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was the synchronized footfall of multiple warriors moving in formation, the kind of coordinated approach that spoke of military training and serious intent. And through the gap in her tarp, she could see them filing into the alley, dozens of figures in tactical gear bearing the insignia of 3 different pack councils, a show of force that made it clear this wasn't just about capturing one rogue alpha, but about eliminating a threat to the entire power structure of the modern pack world. Kieran tried to stand, tried to position himself between Lyra and the approaching threat, but his injuries made him stumble, and she found herself catching him, her small hands steadying his much larger frame. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. Something that had been dormant or suppressed or simply waiting for the right moment to emerge. She felt power flood through her body like moonlight made liquid, felt her Omega nature transform from the gentle, subordinate thing society had told her it should be into something ancient and fierce and utterly undeniable. And when she looked up at the warriors surrounding her shelter, she knew they could see it too, could see the way her eyes had begun to glow with silver light, could smell the change in her pheromones from rejected Omega to something that made even the most dominant alphas. Among them, take an involuntary step back. The leader of the hunting party was a grizzled warrior who bore the marks of the Council Guard, the elite force that enforced pack law across territorial boundaries. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority and the cold certainty of someone who'd made up his mind before he ever arrived. Kirin Nightstalker, you stand accused of abandoning your pack responsibilities, of spreading dangerous ideology about ancient bloodlines that no longer exist, and of kidnapping an unregistered Omega for purposes unknown. Surrender now, and we'll make your execution quick. But before Kirin could respond, before he could try to protect Lyra with words or actions that would only get him killed faster, she stepped forward, moving out of her shelter to stand in the gray morning light, and she felt the full weight of what she was settling onto her shoulders like a crown she'd never asked for, but that fit her head with devastating precision. "He didn't kidnap me," she said, and her voice carried across the alley with a resonance that made the warriors shift uneasily, made their hands move toward weapons, not because she was threatening them, but because some primal part of them recognized that they were in the presence of something their modern sensibilities couldn't categorize or control. "I sheltered him of my own free will, tended his wounds, listened to his truth, and now I stand with him not as some helpless Omega in need of rescue, but as what I actually am, what your councils have been trying to breed out of existence for generations, because you're terrified of Omegas, who don't need your protection or your approval or your carefully controlled pack structures to survive." The silence that followed her declaration was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of the city waking up beyond the alley. And Lyra watched as recognition dawned on the faces of the warriors, watched as their certainty crumbled in the face of something they'd been taught was extinct, but that was now standing before them, radiating power that made their wolves whimper and their human sides question everything they'd been told about pack hierarchy and Omega nature. The Council Guard leader recovered first, his face hardening into a mask of resolve that spoke of a man who'd decided that destroying evidence was more important than acknowledging truth. "If you're claiming to be a Luna Prime," he said, and his tone made it clear he thought the very concept was absurd, "then you're an even greater threat than we anticipated. The councils will never allow ancient power structures to undermine the stability we've built. Better to eliminate both of you now than risk you spreading your delusions to other malcontents and rejected wolves who think the old ways were somehow better than the order we've created." He raised his hand to signal the attack, and Lyra felt Kirin moving behind her, trying once again to shield her with his wounded body. But she was done being protected, done being dismissed, done accepting that her power was something to be hidden or apologized for or destroyed, because it made others uncomfortable with their own carefully maintained illusions of control. She didn't know where the knowledge came from, whether it was genetic memory written into her very cells, or the moon herself whispering instructions through the bond she could now feel connecting her to something vast and ancient and utterly unbreakable. But suddenly she knew exactly what to do, knew how to channel the power building in her chest like a storm gathering strength before it breaks. She raised her hands and spoke words in a language she'd never learned, but that felt older than human speech, older than pack structures and council laws, older than civilization's attempts to tame what was always meant to be wild, and the air around her began to shimmer with silver light that coalesced into forms that made the warriors cry out in shock and fear and something that might have been awe. They were wolves made of moonlight and memory, spectral guardians that had protected Luna Primes since the first Omega had learned to channel the moon's power. And they moved between Lyra and the hunting party with a presence that communicated without words that anyone who tried to harm her would face consequences that transcended death, would answer to powers that predated pack councils and human law and everything the modern world thought it understood about the nature of wolves and Omegas. And the bonds that connected them to forces beyond mortal comprehension. The warriors broke, their formation dissolving as they stumbled backward, weapons falling from nerveless fingers as their wolves recognized what their human sides refused to accept, that they were in the presence of authentic power, the kind that couldn't be controlled or commodified or legislated away by councils, terrified of losing their authority. But the council guard leader stood his ground, his face twisted with a fury that spoke of a man watching his entire worldview crumble, and he raised his weapon with shaking hands, aiming not at Lyra but at Kirin, as though eliminating the Alpha who dared to search for truth might somehow undo the revelation standing before them all in the form of a homeless Omega who glowed with moonlight and commanded spirits the modern world insisted couldn't exist. "If I can't stop this," he snarled, "then I'll at least make sure you pay for starting it." And his finger began to tighten on the trigger. But before he could fire, before Kirin could try to dodge with his injured body, before Lyra could command her spectral guardians to intervene, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, commanding and ancient and carrying harmonics that made every wolf present feel their connection to the moon intensify until it was almost painful. The Blood Moon Pack arrived like an avalanche of muscle and fury and absolute loyalty. Dozens of warriors pouring into the alley with Kirin's second in command, a fierce female beta named Sora, leading the charge with her weapon trained on the council guard leader's heart. "Lower your weapon," she commanded, and her voice carried the kind of authority that came from leading warriors who lived by the old codes, who valued loyalty and truth over political convenience. "Lower it now, or learn what happens when you threaten a Blood Moon Alpha and the Luna Prime he was destined to find." The hunting party was suddenly surrounded, outnumbered by warriors who looked like they'd walked out of legend, whose very presence spoke of lives lived closer to their wolf nature than civilization typically allowed, and Lyra watched as the council guard leader's resolve finally crumbled under the weight of impossible odds and undeniable truth. He lowered his weapon slowly, his face ashen, and Sora moved forward to disarm him and his entire squad with an efficiency that spoke of extensive training and zero tolerance for threats to her Alpha. "How did you find us?" Kirin asked, his voice rough with emotion and relief. And Sora turned to him with eyes that held both reproach and fierce affection. "Did you really think I didn't know about your vision? Did you honestly believe I wouldn't realize immediately when my brother betrayed you and made his deal with the councils? I've been tracking you since you left Packlands, waiting for the right moment to intervene, and when I felt her power awaken through the pack bonds, when every wolf in our territory suddenly felt the moon's presence intensify, I knew you'd finally found her, and that she'd finally found herself." The spectral wolves began to fade as Lyra's conscious control over the power wavered. Exhaustion from channeling forces she barely understood catching up with her all at once, and she would have collapsed if Kirin hadn't been there to catch her, his arms wrapping around her despite his injuries, holding her against his chest while his heart beat steady and strong beneath her cheek. "You did it," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking with pride and relief and something deeper that she was only beginning to recognize as the mate bond settling into place between them. No longer potential, but actual. No longer vision, but reality. "You proved what you are, what you've always been. You showed them all that Luna Primes aren't extinct, that ancient power still flows in Omega bloodlines they tried to suppress, that the old ways aren't dead, but just waiting for the right wolves to remember them." Lyra looked up at him, at this Alpha who'd spent 7 years searching for her, while she'd spent 8 months surviving in alleys and believing she was worthless, and she felt tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen, finally being recognized, finally understanding that her rejection hadn't been about her failure, but about the world's inability to handle her truth. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small despite the power she'd just demonstrated, because transformation was terrifying even when it was exactly what you needed, because accepting destiny meant leaving behind the familiar pain of survival for the unknown challenges of actually living. Kieran smiled then, and it transformed his face from warrior to something softer, something that held promise and protection, and the kind of partnership Lyra had never allowed herself to dream about. "Now we go home," he said simply, "back to Blood Moon territory, where you'll be trained by elders who still remember what Luna Primes are capable of, where you'll learn to control and channel your power, where you'll stand beside me not as subordinate, but as equal, and together we'll rebuild what the councils have tried to destroy. We'll show the wolf world that there's another way, that Omegas don't need to be protected and controlled, that true mate bonds are still possible, that the old magic never left, but was just waiting for wolves brave enough to claim it." He turned to Sora, his expression becoming more serious, more alpha in the leadership sense, rather than the dominant sense. "The traitor?" he asked, and Sora's face went cold in a way that made Lyra grateful she wasn't on the receiving end of that particular expression. "Confined and awaiting your judgment," she reported. "Though if you ask me, any wolf who betrays their alpha for council politics deserves the old punishment, cast out without pack, without name, left to wander as a reminder of what happens when you choose power over loyalty." Kieran nodded, the decision made, and Lyra felt through their forming bond how much it cost him to condemn a wolf he'd once trusted, felt the grief beneath the necessary justice, and she reached up to touch his face, offering silent comfort and understanding. The journey back to Blood Moon territory took 3 days, traveling through wilderness that civilization had largely abandoned, moving through ancient forests where the trees grew so thick the sunlight barely penetrated and the very air felt heavy with old magic and older memories. Lyra rode pressed against Kieran's back on a motorcycle that looked like it had been built more for function than comfort, her arms wrapped around his waist, feeling his body move with the machine beneath them, and with every mile they traveled, she felt the city falling away behind her like a skin she was shedding, felt the rejected Omega she'd been transforming into something new and terrifying and absolutely right. The Blood Moon Pack lands appeared gradually, first as signs that other wolves had passed this way, territorial markers that spoke to those who could read them of boundaries and ancient claims, then as actual structures built to blend with the forest rather than dominate it, homes and gathering places that looked grown rather than constructed, organic and permanent in a way that modern pack compounds with their sterile efficiency and suburban conformity never achieved. And everywhere she looked, Lyra saw wolves, dozens of them, pack members who'd heard about the Luna Prime their alpha had finally found and who'd gathered to witness her arrival with expressions ranging from curious to awed to openly skeptical, because believing something was possible was different than seeing that possibility made flesh and standing before you, radiating power that made the moon herself seem closer and more present. The pack house was built into a cliff face, overlooking a valley where a river cut through stone worn smooth by centuries of water flow. And as Kieran helped her off the motorcycle, as he took her hand and led her up stone steps that looked hand-carved by ancestors who'd built with intention and artistry, Lyra felt the full weight of what she was accepting settling onto her shoulders like that crown again, the responsibility of being not just Omega, but Luna Prime, not just mate, but equal partner. In leadership, not just survivor, but someone wolves would look to for guidance and power and the connection to forces beyond mortal understanding. The Great Hall was filled with pack members, warriors and families and elders whose eyes held the weight of long memory. And when Kieran led her to the center of the space, when he turned to face his pack with her hand still clasped in his, the silence was profound enough to hear individual heartbeats and the soft whisper of breath moving through dozens of lungs. "My pack," Kieran said, and his voice carried to every corner of the hall without him needing to raise it, command and affection woven together in a tone that spoke of a leader who ruled through earned respect rather than enforced dominance. I present to you Lyra, rejected by wolves who couldn't see her value, cast out by alphas who feared her power, left to survive alone in a world that had no place for what she truly is, but surviving nonetheless, enduring with a strength that puts all of us to shame, and finally awakening to her true nature as Luna Prime, as my destined mate, as the Omega who will stand beside me and help guide this pack back to the old ways, back to the wild magic our ancestors knew, back to a way of being wolf that the modern world has forgotten, but that still runs in our blood and our bones and our connection to the moon that watches over us all. An elder stepped forward, a woman whose white hair fell past her waist and whose eyes held depths that suggested she'd seen more than most wolves would experience in 3 lifetimes. And when she looked at Lyra, there was recognition in her gaze, the kind that transcended this moment to touch something eternal and recurring. I am Grandmother Ash, she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly. Last of those who were trained in the old ways before the councils suppressed such knowledge. And I have waited 70 years to see another Luna Prime walk among us, 70 years of keeping the ancient practices alive in secret, teaching young Omegas that their power was not weakness, preserving the rituals and knowledge that the modern world insisted were obsolete superstition. And now here you stand, proof that the moon's bloodline endures despite all attempts to breed it into extinction. She reached out and took Lyra's free hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked ancient as the trees surrounding the Packlands. And Lyra felt power flow between them, recognition passing through touch, elder to inheritor, keeper of secrets to their rightful heir. You have suffered, Grandmother Ash said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement of observed fact. You have been rejected and diminished, and told you were less than what you are, and that suffering has prepared you for what comes next. Because leading as Luna Prime requires understanding what it means to be powerless, so you never abuse the power you now hold, requires knowing abandonment, so you never abandon those who look to you for guidance, requires having survived when the world wanted you dead, so you understand the weight of every life entrusted to your protection. The ritual of acceptance began that night under a moon that hung full and heavy in the sky like a silver eye watching with approval, and Lyra found herself standing in a circle of pack elders while Grandmother Ash painted symbols on her skin with ink made from herbs and moonlight and the blood of previous Luna Primes preserved through generations for exactly this purpose. Each mark carried meaning, connecting her to the long line of Omegas who'd stood where she now stood, who'd accepted the burden of channeling powers beyond human comprehension, who'd served as bridge between their packs and the wild magic that ran beneath the surface of the world like underground rivers most people had forgotten existed. Kieran stood at the circle's edge with his pack, watching with an expression that held both pride and profound relief, and Lyra could feel through their bond that he'd been carrying the weight of his vision alone for so long that sharing it, seeing it confirmed, watching her accept what she was meant to be, was lifting a burden from his shoulders that had been slowly crushing him beneath expectations and responsibilities and the loneliness of leadership. When the marks were complete, when the ink had settled into her skin with a heat that spoke of magic taking hold, Grandmother Ash stepped back and spoke words in that same ancient language Lyra had used to summon the spectral guardians, words that resonated in her bones and her blood and her very soul, and she felt something fundamental shift inside her, felt the last barriers between her human self and her Omega nature dissolve, felt power flood through her in waves that made her gasp and would have made her fall if Kieran hadn't moved, breaking the circle to catch her, holding her steady while the transformation completed itself. The pack howled, dozens of voices rising in harmony that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with recognition, with acceptance, with the primal joy of wolves who'd found what they were looking for even if they hadn't known they were searching. And as their voices rose toward the moon, Lyra felt herself joining them, felt her own voice adding to the chorus, and for the first time in her entire life, she understood what it meant to belong, not as something she had to earn through submission or diminishment, but as something she claimed through the simple act of being exactly what she was meant to be, powerful and vulnerable, ancient and new, rejected and reborn all at once. The weeks that followed were a blur of training and transformation, of learning to control powers that had lain dormant her entire life, waiting for the right moment and the right catalyst to awaken fully. Grandmother Ash proved to be a demanding teacher, pushing Lyra beyond what she thought were her limits, making her channel lunar energy until her body shook with exhaustion, teaching her the old languages and older rituals, showing her how Luna Primes had once served as more than just mates to alphas, but as spiritual leaders in their own right, as healers and seers and warriors who fought with moonlight instead of claws, but were no less deadly for it. And through it all, Kieran was there, not hovering or protecting, but supporting, training alongside her when his injuries had healed enough, sharing leadership responsibilities in a way that made it clear to the entire pack that their Alpha and their Luna Prime were truly equals, two halves of a whole that functioned better together than either could alone. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, moving beyond physical attraction or even the mystical pull of destined mates into something more profound. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared vision, and the kind of trust that came from having seen each other at their most vulnerable and choosing to stay anyway. But the peace couldn't last forever, because the pack councils that had sent hunters after Kieran weren't willing to simply accept that a Luna Prime had emerged and threatened their carefully controlled power structures. 3 months after Lyra's arrival at Blood Moon territory, Sora burst into the Great Hall where Lyra was consulting with elders about upcoming rituals, her face grave and her entire body radiating the kind of tension that came before battle. "They're coming," she announced without preamble. "A coalition force from 6 pack councils, over 200 warriors. They're calling it a peacekeeping mission, but their intent is clear. They mean to eliminate both Kieran and Lyra, to destroy any evidence that Luna Primes still exist, to make an example of Blood Moon Pack so that no other wolves get ideas about returning to the old ways." The hall erupted into controlled chaos, warriors immediately beginning preparations for defense, while elders started protective rituals. And Lyra felt her heart hammering against her ribs because this was it, the moment where everything would be tested, where she would have to prove that her power wasn't just for show, but could actually protect the wolves who'd accepted her when the rest of the world wanted her dead. Kieran found her on the cliff overlooking the valley, standing in the moonlight with her hands pressed against the stone as though drawing strength from the earth itself. And when he wrapped his arms around her from behind, she leaned back into his warmth, accepting the comfort and the solidarity, even as her mind raced through strategies and possibilities. "I won't let them take you," he said against her hair, his voice fierce with protective instinct. But Lyra turned in his arms, meeting his golden eyes with her own silver gaze. And what he saw there made him pause, because it wasn't fear or helplessness, but determination forged in the fires of survival, and tempered by the knowledge of who and what she truly was. "They're not coming to take me," she corrected him gently. "They're coming to destroy the idea of me, to eliminate the proof that their way isn't the only way, that Omegas can be powerful, that the old magic still lives, and I won't let them succeed, Kieran. I won't let them make me small again, won't let them convince the world that what we have here, what we're building, is somehow dangerous or wrong just because it threatens their control." She reached up to cup his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw, feeling through their bond how torn he was between pride in her strength and terror of losing her. "We face them together," she said, and it was both promise and command, Luna Prime speaking to her Alpha, mate speaking to mate, equal speaking to equal. "We show them that Blood Moon Pack doesn't bow to council authority, that true mates can't be separated by politics or fear, that the future they're trying to prevent is already here, and it's not going back into the darkness they tried to bury it in. The coalition force arrived at dawn 3 days later, arrayed at the valley's entrance with weapons and vehicles and the kind of overwhelming force meant to intimidate into surrender without needing to actually fight. But they hadn't accounted for the fact that Blood Moon Pack had spent those 3 days preparing not just physical defenses, but something far more powerful. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that looked almost like a preview of the bloodshed to come, Lyra stood at the valley's center with Kieran at her side and the entire Blood Moon Pack arrayed behind them, over 100 warriors who'd chosen loyalty and truth over the safety of council approval, who'd decided that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. The coalition's leader emerged from their ranks, a council alpha named Marcus who'd built his reputation on ruthless efficiency and absolute obedience to pack law, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the valley with amplified authority. Kieran Nightstalker, you and your pack have been declared rogue by unanimous council decision. Your claims about Luna Primes have been investigated and found to be dangerous delusion. Surrender now, and we'll show mercy to your pack members who were merely following orders. Resist, and we'll be forced to treat this as a rebellion that requires complete elimination. His words were meant to sound reasonable, like he was offering them a choice, but everyone present knew it was theater, that the councils had already decided Blood Moon's fate, and this was just the formality before the execution. Lyra stepped forward before Kieran could respond, and she felt the exact moment when Marcus and his coalition forces recognized what she was, saw it in the way they instinctively stepped back, in the way their wolves whimpered in the presence of power their human sides insisted couldn't exist. "I am Lyra of Blood Moon," she said, and her voice didn't need amplification to carry because she was channeling lunar energy through every word, making them resonate with harmonics that touched something primal in every wolf present. Rejected Omega turned Luna Prime, living proof that your council's breeding programs and power structures are built on lies. And I'm here to tell you that we're not surrendering. Not now, not ever, because what we have here is sacred, is true, is the future your councils are terrified of because it doesn't require their permission or their control. She raised her hands, and the valley filled with silver light, spectral wolves appearing by the dozens, ancient guardians that had protected Luna Primes since the first Omega learned to channel the moon's power, and she watched as the coalition force's certainty crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence that everything they'd been told was impossible was manifesting right before their eyes. "You can attack us," Lyra continued, her voice now carrying notes of command that made even Marcus straighten involuntarily. "You can try to destroy what we're building, but you can't undo what I've proven, can't make me disappear back into the rejection and invisibility you tried to bury me in. And every moment you spend fighting us is another moment that word spreads about the Luna Prime who survived your council's attempts at genocide, who awakened despite all your efforts to breed ancient bloodlines into extinction, who stands here with her true mate and her pack and dares you to try and take from her what the moon herself has blessed." The standoff held for a moment that stretched into eternity, coalition forces facing Blood Moon Pack across a valley floor that had become a threshold between old ways and new, between council control and wild freedom, between the safe lies of the modern pack world and the dangerous truths of ancient magic that had never actually died but just gone into hiding, waiting for wolves brave enough to call it back. And then something unexpected happened, something that would change everything in ways none of them could have anticipated in that moment of tension and imminent violence. A young Omega stepped out from the coalition ranks, a girl who couldn't have been more than 20, with eyes that held too much pain for her age, and she walked across the no-man's land between the two forces with her head held high despite the way her whole body trembled with fear and determination mixed into something that looked a lot like hope. "My name is Iris," she said when she reached Lyra, her voice soft but steady. "And I was told I was defective too, cast out by my pack for being too sensitive, for having visions they said were madness, for refusing to accept the bond they tried to force on me with an alpha who made my skin crawl. And I've been searching for something, someone who could tell me I wasn't broken. And here you are, living proof that the councils lied, that there's nothing wrong with us, that we were just being measured against standards designed to make us fail so they could maintain control over Omega nature and Omega power. She dropped to her knees before Lyra, not in submission, but in recognition, and tears were streaming down her face as she looked up at the Luna Prime who represented everything she'd been told couldn't exist. "Please," Iris whispered, "please tell me there are others like us. Please tell me I can learn what you've learned. Please give me a place to belong where I don't have to be small or quiet or constantly apologizing for taking up space." And then another Omega stepped forward, and another, dozens of them emerging from the coalition ranks or appearing from the edges of the valley where they'd been watching in hiding. Rejected wolves who'd heard whispers of a Luna Prime who'd awakened, and who'd come hoping for proof that their rejection wasn't about their failure, but about the world's fear of their potential. And as they gathered around Lyra, as they knelt or stood with expressions ranging from desperate hope to fierce determination, the coalition forces found themselves facing something they hadn't prepared for, weren't trained to handle. The possibility that this wasn't about eliminating one rogue pack, but about confronting a movement, an awakening of Omegas who'd been told they were worthless, discovering that they'd been lied to all along. Marcus looked at his warriors, at the way some of them were wavering, looking at their own Omega Pack members with new uncertainty, questioning orders they'd never thought to question before, and Lyra could see the exact moment he realized he'd already lost, not because Blood Moon was stronger, but because truth once revealed couldn't be hidden again, no matter how many wolves they eliminated or how much power the councils claimed to hold. "Stand down," Marcus finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of a man watching his entire worldview collapse. And though some of his warriors looked ready to argue, to insist they should fight anyway because orders were orders and council authority couldn't be openly defied, ultimately they lowered their weapons because what else could they do when faced with dozens of Omegas who'd chosen to stand with Blood Moon rather than return to packs that had rejected them when faced with living? Proof that Luna Primes existed and that the council's carefully constructed lies were unraveling in real time. "This isn't over," he added, but it sounded like a formality rather than a threat, like words he was saying because his position required it rather than because he believed them. "The councils will have to respond to this, will have to decide how to handle a Luna Prime and a pack that's openly defying established order. But that's a conversation for another day, for leaders who have the authority to make decisions I'm not equipped to make." He turned his coalition forces and began the retreat back toward council territories, leaving behind the Omegas who'd chosen Blood Moon, leaving behind the certainty he'd arrived with, leaving behind the comfortable world where pack councils held absolute authority and ancient bloodlines were safely extinct. The celebration that night was unlike anything Lyra had ever experienced. The great hall packed with Blood Moon pack members and the new arrivals, the rejected Omegas who'd chosen to seek sanctuary in a place where being powerful wasn't treated as defective, where having visions wasn't called madness, where refusing unsuitable bonds wasn't punished with expulsion and the kind of invisibility that felt like death by degrees. Grandmother Ash moved among them with a joy that made her look decades younger, assessing each new Omega for signs of latent power, identifying those who might carry Luna Prime bloodlines that had been suppressed or hidden, beginning to plan the training programs that would help them understand and control abilities they'd been taught to fear or deny. And in the center of it all stood Lyra with Kieran beside her, his hand in hers, their bond now fully formed and radiating a connection that every wolf present could feel like warmth spreading through the whole pack. A reminder that true mates weren't a fantasy but a reality that required recognizing your equal rather than trying to dominate or diminish them into something manageable and safe. Iris approached them as the celebration reached its height, her earlier fear replaced by a cautious hope that was beautiful to witness. And when she looked at Lyra, there was worship in her expression, but also something more important: recognition of possibility, of potential, of a future she'd never allowed herself to imagine. "What happens now?" she asked. The same question Lyra had asked Kieran months ago in a cardboard shelter in an alley that felt like a lifetime away from this great hall filled with acceptance and belonging and the wild joy of wolves who'd found their place in the world. Lyra smiled, squeezing Kieran's hand before releasing it to embrace Iris, this young Omega who reminded her so much of who she'd been before awakening. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom and absolute certainty. "Now we build something new," Lyra said, her words carrying to every corner of the hall, addressing not just Iris, but every rejected Omega who'd chosen to stand with Blood Moon, every wolf who'd decided that truth mattered more than comfortable lies. "We create a sanctuary for Omegas who don't fit the Council's narrow definitions of acceptable. We train Luna Primes and powerful Omegas who've been told their gifts are defects. We prove that there's another way to be wolf, another way to form packs and bonds and communities that doesn't require submission or diminishment or constantly making yourself smaller so others feel bigger, and we do it together, not because I'm some savior who's going to fix everything, but because we're stronger as a collective than we ever could be alone. Because every Omega who awakens to their true power makes it harder for the councils to maintain their lies, because the future belongs to those brave enough to claim it, even when the world says they have no right to anything beyond survival and invisibility." The months that followed saw Blood Moon territory transform into something unprecedented in the modern wolf world, a refuge for rejected Omegas and a training ground for those discovering powers they'd been taught to suppress. A place where Luna Prime bloodlines that had been carefully bred into near extinction began to resurface as Omegas learned they didn't have to hide what they were. Word spread despite the Council's attempts to control the narrative, whispers becoming stories, becoming a movement of wolves, questioning the authority structures they'd always accepted without examination, asking why Omegas needed to be controlled, why ancient bloodlines had been suppressed, why true mate bonds had been replaced with political alliances and breeding programs designed to produce predictable results rather than powerful individuals. And at the center of it all was Lyra, the homeless Omega who'd sheltered a wounded Alpha for one night and ended up awakening to become Luna Prime, living proof that rejection wasn't the end, but sometimes the beginning of discovering who you were always meant to be. Kieran watched his mate work with a pride that threatened to overwhelm him sometimes, watched her train young Omegas in channeling lunar energy, watched her stand before councils who came to investigate or intimidate and refused to be diminished by their authority, watched her transform Blood Moon from a single pack into something larger, a coalition of wolves who'd chosen freedom over safety, truth over comfortable lies, wild magic over civilized control. And in quiet moments, when they were alone in their quarters overlooking the valley that had become home in ways the cities never could, he would hold her and remember the night he'd stumbled into her alley, more dead than alive. Remember how she'd helped him despite having every reason to protect herself first. Remember the way she'd glowed with power when she finally accepted what she was. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one night with the moon hanging full outside their window. "Do you ever wish you could go back to the simplicity of just surviving, of not carrying the weight of being Luna Prime and everything that represents?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her head resting on his chest, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin that mirrored the marks Grandmother Ash had painted during her acceptance ritual. And when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of certainty that came from having lived through the worst and discovered you were stronger than you knew. "I don't regret it," she said finally, "because even when I was just surviving, even when I was homeless and rejected and convinced I was worthless, I was still searching for something even if I didn't know what, still hoping for recognition even if I'd given up believing it would come. And yes, being Luna Prime is hard. Yes, the responsibility is overwhelming sometimes. Yes, there are moments when I wonder if I'm strong enough for what's being asked of me, but I'd rather carry this weight and know I matter, know I have purpose, know I'm helping other Omegas find their strength, then go back to being invisible and safe and slowly dying inside from lack of meaning. She shifted to look up at him, her silver eyes catching moonlight and reflecting it back with an intensity that still took his breath away even after months of seeing it daily. "You gave me that," she continued, her voice softening. "You saw me when I was invisible, recognized me when I was convinced I was forgettable, believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, and that gift, that recognition, that love, is worth every challenge we face together. Worth every counsel that tries to destroy us, worth every Omega we train who becomes powerful enough to threaten their control. Worth building this future even if we never see it fully realized because we're planting seeds that will grow long after we're gone." The sun rose over Blood Moon territory, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, illuminating the great hall where dozens of Omegas were beginning their morning training. Highlighting the warriors who patrolled borders not to keep others out, but to protect what had been built within, warming the stone of the pack house that had become home to wolves who'd spent too long believing they had no right to homes or safety, or the wild joy of belonging to something greater than themselves. And in their quarters overlooking it all, Kieran and Lyra stood together, watching the pack wake and begin another day of transformation and training, and the slow work of building a future that councils insisted was impossible, and they knew that the journey was far from over, that there would be more battles and more councils and more wolves who needed awakening to the truth of what they could be. But in that moment, standing together with the sun rising and the pack thriving and the bond between them stronger than steel and sweeter than any dream, they also knew that they'd already won the most important battle. The one against the lie that said rejected Omegas were worthless. The one that said ancient power was dead. The one that claimed true mates and Luna Primes and wild magic were just stories told to children who didn't know better than to believe in impossible things. Because Lyra had been homeless and rejected and invisible, had spent months surviving in alleys with nothing but cardboard walls and the kind of desperate courage it took to keep breathing when the world insisted you didn't matter, had sheltered a wounded alpha for one night because her Omega nature couldn't ignore pain, even when logic said protecting herself had to come first. And that single choice, that moment of compassion and connection, had awakened her to the truth that she'd never been. Defective or worthless or forgettable, had always been exactly what she was meant to be, had always carried Luna Prime power in her blood, just waiting for the right catalyst and the right recognition to bring it forth. And now she stood as living proof that rejection wasn't the end, but sometimes the beginning, that what the world despised was often what it feared most, that the homeless Omega sheltering in an alley had always been sacred even when no one else could see it. And that recognition, that validation, that love from an alpha who'd searched 7 years to find her, had transformed everything, had rewritten her story from tragedy to triumph, from rejection to redemption, from invisible to absolutely, undeniably gloriously seen. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the ache of rejection transform into the power of recognition, hit that subscribe button and join the Alpha Reversed family, where we explore the sacred truth that what the world despises is often what it fears most. Drop a comment sharing which moment broke you open, and check out our playlist for more stories of Omegas, discovering they were never broken, just waiting for the right moment to remember they were always meant to be legendary.